Hi guys, Pastor Mark here. Thanks so much for joining us tonight again. What another beautiful day in Scotland anyway it is. I hope you're well, and thank you so much for joining us yesterday as we started going through a study of Ephesians. And I mentioned yesterday that it'd be good if everybody who's involved in it could just read Ephesians all the way through. It'd take about 15-20 minutes, which is not a lot to read, which I'm sure you all did. Okay, we're not going to go there because I don't want you to lie right away before I even start. Okay, well, yesterday it was like an introduction, and I heard Sinclair Ferguson saying introductions are a bit, can become the longest sermon in any series that you do. And because of that, and I was grateful for that, because I'm kind of still in an introduction. But really what I want to do is and I've wrote some notes here, so I'm not going to pretend that I'm not looking at notes here. I see some people doing videos and they're doing that and pretending not to look. Just tell people you're looking. And anyway, that what I want to do is I want to give a bit more background, because I think it's so important. It's like why the letters wrote. So why is it important? No, why is it important that we are discussing the book of Ephesians now? So it has to be in my mind, or in the preacher's mind, or the writer's mind, that why they feel that's important. And that's why it's important for us to delve in a bit more before we get into the actual text, to understand what was going on. And so part two is the history of the culture, the opposition, and what was going on in the environment that made Paul write this letter, or what he felt compelled to write this letter. At the end of the day, Paul had been pastoring there for 3 years. 3 years, it was like his baby. It was his church. He established so much there. He established leadership there. Eldership was established. The greatest teachers on the planet ever, who have preached the gospel out with Christ, was part of that church at some time or another. Paul preached there for 3 years and was a pastor. Imagine going to church every day. Who's preaching this morning? Apostle Paul. How amazing is that? Timothy preached there. Apollos, who was the founder at the beginning of it, before it was really a church, but he then gets saved. He was teaching before that about the promise of the coming Messiah, then gets saved and get corrected with Priscilla and Aquila, and then he was a phenomenal, he was a dynamite, absolutely dynamic teacher, so they had him as well. They also had Timothy, they had John. Apostle John spent much of his later life as part of an elder. He was an elder in the church in Ephesus. This church is steeped in amazing tradition. But for me, it's so easy for me to allow my mind to drift as we read about the Ephesians church, to drift to Revelations chapter 2, where we read about what the church was like and what Jesus then seen in the church 30 years later when John wrote that. And I'm not saying that the Ephesian letter was a warning. It was not a warning, but I think when you look back in history, you can almost see it as a warning. If you don't adhere to these principles, this is what will start happening, as did in many of the other churches in Revelations, where they started to allow and embrace things. At the time, Ephesians church was probably the most important church in the world. Many churches, it would have been a huge church. And many other splinter churches, or that's not the right word, like church plants would have came from that. It was the shop window church of Christianity church, maybe outside Jerusalem, or even maybe more so. All the best teachers, they had everything going for it. Paul set up leadership there, eldership there. But this letter isn't a sounding warning, as I say, but as time goes on, you think, you know what, this is it becomes almost like a warning letter, but it wasn't at the time. Ephesus was, let me tell you a bit more about Ephesus. Ephesus was what was the battleground like is maybe a better thing. The battleground and the environment. What was the environment? What was the culture around Ephesus? Well, for a start, it was a huge trading place. It was, which that in itself doesn't make it negative, but it was very materialistic. It was almost a modern day Sodom and Gomorrah. Ephesus, it was very liberal, very fleshy. They worshipped a god there called Artemis. She was the Greek and Roman goddess of fertility, very sexualized, very fleshy, and people flocked there from all over to go and worship her. One of the ancient wonders of the world was the temple built to worship this goddess who was absolutely worshipped there. And they would come and they would make little silver trinket. People would come in pilgrims and they would buy stuff and buy paraphernalia and buy all sorts of stuff and statues and parts of silver with her name on it. Well, then what happens is that's all going on, and it was huge business. But people are getting saved left, right and centre as Paul is preaching right in the epicentre, right in the centre of this city. I love just how God does that. He just takes his church and he just plants it right in a place and goes, you know what, this is going to be the difference between the God of heaven and earth and the God who's made by human hands. And that was the message. It was a gospel message, and people were getting saved everywhere, and this church was exploding, and people were absolutely up in arms, creating division. And so the church in Ephesus was constantly getting hammered by opposition. A group of people called the Nicolaitans, who talks about in Revelations 2, and the Ephesian church, the Christians, they hated them, and God says, which I also hated. And they were able to withstand any opposition. The persecution was coming, and as the persecution came, you know what happens? Church gets stronger and stronger and stronger. And that's what the Ephesians church was like. And these people were up in arms because they were losing a fortune. People were usually walking about with these little silver paraphernalia and all sorts were flinging away. Nobody was buying this stuff, so people are losing money. And what then happens is the Nicolaitans church, the Nicolaitans, they end up declaring that they're saved and they're Christians also, and God's a God of freedom, and why would they not want you to enjoy things and enjoy things of the flesh? That's what they've done, and they tried to bring that into the church, but the Ephesians church stood strong against it. Unlike other churches, as we know about, if you read in Revelations 2 and 3, it says the problem is you let them in. You tolerated that, and what ended up happening in all other churches is they morphed into it. The culture then morphed into the church. You couldn't differentiate between a believer and a fake believer who was there for materialistic gain. You see the similarities, people? And this is what was Paul's answer to that? Paul's answer to that stuff was stay strong in your faith, stay strong in the word. No, don't lose your first love, which they ended up doing 30 years later. What was that first love? The doctrine, the word, the relationship with God. Don't allow all this culture to come in. Nowadays, the church is actually embracing it. It's not even a battle for culture to get into the church. The church is opening the doors and welcoming it in with open arms. And before you know it, all sorts of stuff has been tolerated and accepted in church. Well, the Ephesians church was not like that in the letter. At the time when the letter was wrote, they were certainly not like that. They were strong because they had the great teaching. They had great men of God who had spoken into their life. 3 years down the line, Paul a prisoner, or 2 or 3 years down the line, Paul a prisoner in Rome, writing to the church in Ephesus and the surrounding churches where it were now, and says, remember the teaching we give, remember and stand strong in the word. Then in the second part of the book, 46, it talks about renewing the mind. No, remember that you're not of the flesh, put on the new man. No, don't longer be corrupt, because these thoughts, and they were constantly, had all this fornication, they had all this sexualized stuff everywhere round about them, and that was constantly hammering into their life, and they stayed strong. 30 years later, hundreds of years later, the church compromised. The church in Ephesus compromised, but in this letter, there was certainly no compromise at the time. The church was getting stronger and stronger and stronger amidst all the culture, because they never embraced what the world wanted and what the world desired. They stayed strong to God and his word, and that's why the first 3 chapters, which we'll start tomorrow, and we'll start reading through it, that what Paul was saying and why he was saying it. So I hope that helps, because it gives us a better grounding when we begin to read this about what he was wanting to achieve, what he was wanting people to take with them, what he was wanting to remind them of, so that they would stay strong in their faith in the midst of constant opposition from the culture. And all the fleshy stuff that was going on. Okay guys, hope you enjoyed that. Join me again tomorrow and we'll open up the book and see how it goes. Alright, take care.